This is Guillaume Long. He's a Senior Policy Analyst at the Center for Economic and Policy Research, previously held several cabinet positions in the government of Ecuador, most recently served as Ecuador's permanent representative to the United Nations in Geneva. He has a Ph.D. in international politics from the University of London and is visiting with us here via electronic means from Brazil. Guillaume, welcome back to the program. It's great to have you with us. What does Lula's victory show? First of all, what does Lula's victory tell us about the politics of Brazil right now?
Oh, thanks very much for having me on the show. I think Lula's victory is the most significant political occurrence in Latin America in a long time, potentially in a number of years. It really consolidates a new shift to progressive governments, to left-of-center governments, if you like, in the region that's been ongoing now for a couple of years. And of Brazil being the largest economy, the biggest, most important demographically speaking, the most important economically speaking, of course, geographically speaking, it's kind of the big power in the Latin American region. This shift to the left is even more significant, and a lot of governments and a lot of Latin American journalists, governments, political actors, political parties have been watching these elections in Brazil unfold with a lot of attention. What it means is, of course, the demise of a very radical far-right government in Brazil. And it's very interesting because many parallels that can be drawn with the United States, with the return of sort of a broad coalition of democratic governance from sort of the left to the center-right against this far-right message and this far-right government represented by Jair Bolsonaro. But it also means something else, which is maybe less positive. Lula wins with a very, very narrow margin indeed, less than 2 percentage points. He got 50.9 versus 49.1%. So a very narrow victory, which also means that Bolsonaro is out. This kind of neo-fascistic government, many have called it that way, is going to finish on the 1st of January. There's going to be a transition to a much more democratic form of government. But as a political force, again, mirroring what's happening in the United States, as a political force, the Brazilian far right is very, very strong. And in some regions of Brazil, it's in fact being strengthened. And so it's not going anywhere. The far right is there to stay.
Well, I'm seeing reports that parts of the country are being shut down by Bolsonaro followers in protest. That Bolsonaro is supposed to give a speech today, that there is some speculation that he may be trying to pull a Trump, claiming that the election was stolen from him, that he's not going to leave, that he's trying to get the military to go along with him and basically have a military coup. What's actually the story here?
So that's what he's been doing for the last few months. In fact, he'd warned on several occasions that if he lost the elections, he wouldn't recognize the result. He'd been very clear about this. He said that the only way he could lose the election was there was widespread fraud, et cetera, et cetera. But, in order to pull that kind of rhetoric and have an effect and sort of, essentially orchestrate a coup, which is what he was, de facto arguing, you need support. And you need support. You need either institutional support or you need, the electoral authorities were always sort of defending the electoral process. The military has not supported him. By and large, even people in Bolsonaro's party, so governors who have been elected at the head of various states, because we also had elections at the state level for governors on Sunday. Many of his, people close to Bolsonaro have actually recognized the presidential elections, recognized the presidential result, because, of course, putting the elections into question would question their own election, right? So a lot of people have deserted Bolsonaro in terms of his fraud narrative. So he's very much on his own. But what's even more interesting is that he hasn't done either. He hasn't recognized the results. He hasn't come out to congratulate Lula on his victory, but he hasn't, cried fraud either. He's basically, since Sunday, nobody knows really where Bolsonaro is. Well, we kind of know that he's in the presidential palace, but a lot of speculation whether he's locked up in a room. He's basically not said anything. He's not tweeted. He's not given any media declaration. He's disappeared. He's off the radar. And so, of course, if you're going to, push for this kind of coup outcome, You would expect him to be mobilizing his base. You would expect him to have come out on the evening of the elections denouncing what he would have seen as foul play. He hasn't done any of that. He's basically gone up. Nobody knows. The main newspaper in Brazil today, Folha de São Paulo, the largest newspaper, sort of called it sort of a childish, teenage behavior, sort of a tantrum. Nobody knows what's going on. So apparently he's going to come out and speak today. We'll have to see what he says. But by and large, I think institutions, whether it's the military, civil institution, the political system, the courts, are all behind the electoral results. I really can't see how the results could be overturned. There have, as you said, been a few protests. Some of Bolsonaro's supporters have come out on the streets, but not in large numbers. In fact, the biggest disruption are truck drivers who have blocked a few key highways. Truck drivers are famously pro-Bolsonaro in Brazil for a number of reasons, including the fact that he eliminated speed cameras and got rid of taxes on fuel and so on and so forth. But so obviously truck drivers have big capacity for disruption. They park their trucks across the highways and it creates a lot of disruption. But the police have been loyal. They're clearing the truck drivers off the highways with tear gas today. The military has been absolutely loyal to the electoral results. I can't see him going anywhere with this sort of January 6th strategy. Very
good news. Now, here in the United States, in 1964 was the year that the Republican Party in the United States rolled out a campaign arguing that there was massive voter fraud across the country and that Barry Goldwater losing the election, would be or was a consequence of that, and using that voter fraud rhetoric as an excuse to really clamp down on, in particular, black voting in the South. This has been amplified election after election in the 58 years since then, to the point that Donald Trump was able to weaponize it very, very effectively, and we've got some between 200 and 300 Republican candidates running for political office right now in the United States who openly are saying that our elections are fraudulent, they can't be trusted. And, you can't have a democracy if people don't trust the central core of it, which is the election. So we've had this 58-year campaign in the United States to get Americans comfortable with this idea that the Democrats steal elections, essentially. Has there been a parallel to that in Brazil? How does Brazil keep track of who can and cannot vote? And how long has, you said Bolsonaro has been talking about election fraud, how long has that kind of rhetoric been ricocheting around that country?
Yeah, so there has been a parallel to that, but it's much more recent. It doesn't go back to the 60s. Well, first of all, Brazil was a dictatorship between exactly 1964. You mentioned that date, 1985. It was a return to democracy after 1985. And since then, really, and that's true throughout Latin America, but particularly in Brazil, the electoral system has been significantly strengthened. It even became a pride for Brazil because it was one of the sort of first, it's an electronic voting system. So Brazilians, since the late 80s and completely since the early 90s, have been voting on machines, which they were very proud of, contrary to the rest of Latin America, which is still ballots. It's an electronic voting system. I was actually an electoral observer on Sunday, and the checks and the controls and the audits of the machines, and it's really quite sophisticated. And throughout Latin America, democratization in the 80s and 90s, you were talking about voter suppression. Democratization was really a move towards universal suffrage with a lot of political will, and I would say on all sides of the political spectrum, to do the reverse than what you were describing. So no voter suppression, to encourage voters to vote. In fact, in Brazil, voting is compulsory. So, the reverse.
So everybody votes. Everybody must vote.
Well, not everybody votes, because there's always a small percentage of abstention, people in extremely rural areas, or people who just don't want to vote.
Right.
But, then in order to get a passport, or there are a few things, sort of official documents that you can't get without paying a fine if you haven't voted. Right? So you're very much encouraged. In a number of Latin American countries, it's like that. In fact, in a number of European countries as well.
Sure.
So voting is compulsory. You can, of course, not vote, but then you'll have a small fine if you want to, renew some ID or various things that you can't get without your voting certificate. So no, the reverse of voter suppression. Now, it is true that for the last 4 years, Bolsonaro has been in power for 4 years. He has created that narrative that we were talking about of making people doubt of the voting system. So you have increasingly a parallel narrative, a fake news narrative, very similar again from the United States.
Guillaume, I'm sorry, we're out of time, but it's an amazing story. Thank you so much for dropping by and sharing it with us.